Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NRRI and the GridWise Alliance webinar for today. How can we protect the electric grid against cyber attacks? Obviously, a new big question going through us today. I'm Sherry Lichtenberg, the Deputy Director of NRRI, and welcome all of you. We have about 300 people registered for this webinar, and we're very excited to have you. For those of you who are not familiar with NRRI, we are the research arm of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. We study the regulated and unregulated utilities, and we provide research and training, both live and online. And we try to do these webinars monthly so that we can bring new and updated information to you. Let me welcome you and pass the microphone to Karen Wayland from the GridWise Alliance.
Thank you, Sherry, and I apologize for the lighting and sound quality, but I had to move outside for a long, convoluted reason. But I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the GridWise Alliance. For those of you who are not familiar with GridWise, we are an association of utilities of all business models, vendors, grid equipment manufacturers, national labs, and others, all working to leverage that diverse viewpoint to articulate the benefits of a modern grid. We were founded in the early 2000s in very close relationship with the Department of Energy. In fact, the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory actually owns the GridWise name, and we rent it from them. That's how close we are with the DOE complex. We have been working for many years, both at the federal level and the state level, and we're very excited to be pairing with NRI on this webinar because so much of the work in the electricity industry happens at the state level, and we hope that this is the first of many and a long partnership in sharing the GridWise insights with the members and the regulatory community, since we all work so closely together. So thank you, Sherry. And I will note that Pete Fisher, one of the speakers here, and I, among others, published a paper on cybersecurity that you'll hear about that NRI published, and we thank them again for that opportunity as well.
Thank you, Karen. We're very excited to partner with you. The paper was published in our in the Insights series that we do. Let me, without further ado, turn the meeting over to Commissioner David Ober, who is with the Commissioner with the Indiana Commission and who is NRRI's board chair. Commissioner Ober, it's you.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, and good afternoon to all of you who are joining us today. As Sherry introduced, my name is Dave Ober, and I am a commissioner from the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission. And I also have the great honor of serving as the chair of the board for NRRI. Definitely appreciate GridWise for helping collaborate on this. We hope that this will be a great discussion this afternoon. It's my pleasure to moderate the discussion with Lynn Constantini, who is the Deputy Director of the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation, Peter Fishers, who's Senior Director of Cyber Programs for the Sierra Nevada Corporation, Eric Myers, VP and Chief Information Security Officer for the New York Power Authority, and Carol Elstein, Principal Solutions Partner for Dell EMC. This is a growing issue, a very important issue, one that in light of the Colonial pipeline ransomware attack earlier this summer, as well as a recent one from Oldsmar, Florida, where a water utility was compromised. This is going to become more of a prevalent issue for commissioners around the country and around the world. And hopefully we'll be able to shed some light on some best practices, or at least enumerate some things to take back to your commissions to start these conversations. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Lynn Constantini to turn on her video, and I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Lynn, I think you're muted.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, if anybody could hear me. So thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, for that introduction. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. This is a very, very important subject. And I appreciate the invitation to weigh in on this very important subject today. The title of this webinar is How Can We Protect the Electric Grid Against Cyber Threats? I've been asked specifically to focus on the very last part of that topic statement, and that is a cyber threat. What is a cyber threat? We're going to start with the very basics. So if you would change the slide, please, Jeff. So according to NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, who define things like this, a cyber threat is any incident, any circumstance that has the potential to adversely impact operations and that is conducted, the event is actually conducted through an information system via unauthorized access. And essentially it's for the purpose of doing harm. So that level threat, what the threat is, or level set, I should say, but those who threaten, we call them threat actors. And a threat actor can be an insider with a grudge, criminal gangs that are looking for a big payday, or even nation states who are explicitly looking to do our nation harm. And, you know, a cyber threat can result in a cyber attack. So a threat is just the promise of something happening, but an attack is something that actually has happened. And unfortunately, we have plenty of examples of cyber attacks actually happening. So cyber threat actors actually being successful. We read about their successful attacks each and every week. So for example, last week, T-Mobile was attacked. Yet again, this is not the first time T-Mobile's been attacked. More than 50 million with an M, user records were stolen. Also, very recently, a hacker has claimed that he stole more than 70 million records from AT&T and put them for sale on the dark web. Now, AT&T denies that happened, but we haven't seen any evidence that it has not. And more newsworthy, not necessarily as recent, but just as newsworthy, Yahoo has been attacked. Millions and millions and millions of user records stolen. Equifax, the credit rating company, had millions of records stolen. And the OMB was attacked, and millions of confidential records were stolen from the OMB. And the kind of information that is in those data breaches is personally identifiable information. So it's customer name, customer address, customer social security number, phone number, really sensitive information that can be very, very financially beneficial for hackers to have in their possession. But typically, those kind of data breaches, those kind of cyber attacks are explicitly against information technology systems. And the attackers, the threat actors, are typically people that are looking for financial gain. They sell that really juicy, valuable information on the dark web for lots of money. But as devastating as a data breach is, and those kind of cyber attacks are for the company that actually experiences it and the customer who suffers the consequences, they're not necessarily the worst kind of attacks. Data breaches, again, infected intellectual property, they typically involve only information technology systems. So if you go to the next slide, let's differentiate what an information technology system is from those systems that I believe are even more consequential in terms of what a cyber attack could actually do. And that's really more in line with the topic here, those systems that operate the electric grid. So an IT system, again, just to level set, is a system that generally supports business functions. So we're talking about their accounting systems, their HR systems, their purchasing systems. They run the business. It's the operational technology systems that actually control a physical process. Generally, in the past, OT systems were not specific targets of cyber attackers. But we have seen, dating back into the mid-2000s, that has certainly changed. OT systems were generally considered to be very specific knowledge required to even perpetrate an attack. Or those systems were so obscure that security by obscurity actually was a security position for some of these utilities and other manufacturing processes, manufacturing companies, people in the chemical field. They all didn't necessarily think that their risk of cyber attack was as great on the OT side as it was on the IT side. But again, we have plenty of evidence that that is no longer the case, if it ever was. So if you go to the next slide, please. Let's talk about some of these OT-specific attacks. One of the first ones that I can remember was Aurora. And Aurora was not perpetrated by a cyber threat actor, but it was perpetrated really more as a demonstration that the old way of thinking about cybersecurity around operational technology was indeed false. Aurora was a demonstration project that was conducted by the Idaho National Labs. And they actually demonstrated live on TV that using cyber means, they could destroy an electric generator. So right there, the myth of cyber not being a threat to OT systems was debunked. But we have plenty of other examples. Stuxnet, you may have heard, that was probably one of the very first that was sensationalized. This is the event where nuclear reactors were disrupted through cyber means. Another event, Shamoon. You may have heard of the Saudi Aramco attack. 30,000 computers that were used by Saudi Aramco to manage the business of oil production were wiped out. It took Saudi Aramco months and months to restore full service to its systems. And probably two of the most recognizable attacks happened in 2015 and 2016, almost exactly a year apart. And these events were largely considered some of the first nation-state sponsored attacks on a utility system. Russia attacked Ukraine and actually brought the electric grid down. In 2015, the threat actors took control of an operator console and started operating breakers, just as if they were sitting in front of the control console. It caused electric outages in 3 distribution entities within Ukraine. And it kept lights out for 6 hours. And in 2016, a very similar event happened, except this time, nobody on the other end, human, was operating remotely the console and closing breakers. They had automated the attack. So no humans were involved in bringing down the electric grid in Kiev, Ukraine. It was all automated. It was all coded. So that was really a very eye-opening event for utility operators around the world. And it's only because there was enough institutional knowledge left as to how to control the grid manually that the 2016 incident wasn't worse. Another example of a very, very successful attack was the NotPetya attack of 2017. That too was perpetrated by Russians. It started in Ukraine, so there's kind of a theme there. And this is really renowned for the speed with which it spread worldwide. It wasn't necessarily targeted to OT systems, but it had the effect of bringing down information technology systems that affected operational technology. So again, the speed and the sheer destructive capacity of NotPetya was, again, a wake-up call for those operating utility, the electric grid, pipelines, water systems, etc. And there's another one that happened late in, I believe it was 2019, and it was the Trisys attack. This was largely considered the first attack against a safety instrumented system. Safety instrumented systems are systems that are operated specifically to ensure the safety of personnel working in OT environments. So think about an automated shutoff valve, if you will. Someone actually tampered with that system in a company in the Middle East. There's only one reason really why someone would tamper with a safety instrumented system, and that is to do harm to the workforce within that facility. Again, another example of how destructive these events can actually be. And it also gives us some insight into the motivation of these attackers. And the last event that happened in 2020 was an event I'm sure we all are aware of, and the virus or the malware was called Sunburst, but the event is very popularly known as SolarWinds. SolarWinds is unique because it's one of the first documented supply chain attacks. And what happened was an IT security vendor has customers worldwide actually downloaded patches to the software that had been infected with malware. So the threat actor had actually gotten into the supply chain provider's system infected the patches that customers had no reason to realize were infected, and they did the right thing. They brought the patch down and they applied the patch as they were instructed to do. But because that patch was poisoned, that malware spread far and wide. The ramifications of that SolarWinds attack are still being felt today. This was discovered in December of 2020. Experts suggest that it was actually in the IT vendor's system in March of 2020, and most likely even earlier. So our threat actors, those that are wishing to do us harm, have been in our systems for a long time. Now, we don't know why they were in the system. We don't know what they did once they got in there. But just the fact that the supply chain itself was poisoned, again, gives us a new appreciation for the extent that our adversaries will go to disrupt utility services. But sadly, these aren't the most recent events that have happened. If you go to the next slide, Jeff. In February 2021, there's a water treatment plant in Oldsmar, Florida, where an attacker actually changed the levels of chemicals in the water, changed those levels to poisonous levels of chemicals. It was only because a human sitting in the control center realized that something was amiss and was able to change those set points down again was a real catastrophe averted. And lastly, I'll talk about something that is probably still on the minds of many. And this occurred in May, and it was the Colonial pipeline ransomware attack. Now, ransomware wasn't specifically directed to OT systems, but it had the effect of bringing the pipeline down. So they attacked the pipeline and the business system, and out of an abundance of caution, Colonial took down its operations system as well. The consequences were gas lines up and down the East Coast. Again, that was more of an attack of opportunity than directed at the Colonial pipeline. But again, attacks of opportunity certainly have real world effects. If you go to the next slide, Jeff. Speaking of ransomware, I just wanted to give you some perspective. Ransomware is really becoming a scourge, and whether it's on the OT side or IT that affects OT, or now specifically directed to OT systems because the financial gain for attackers is huge, it's only growing. The ransoms that are being paid are now in the millions where they used to be in the thousands. And attackers now, because of Colonial Pipeline, realize what it's worth to us not to have our files encrypted. Last slide. So I want to reflect back on the reason that I was asked to talk about cyber threats and the purpose of this webinar. What can be done about cyber threats? And why are cyber threats so top of mind? Well, it's not just because that there's threats against the electric grid itself, or a water system, or a pipeline. It's the fact that all of these systems are interconnected. And what affects the electric grid affects gas pipelines and affects water treatment plants, and vice versa. So the ecosystem is really what we need to be focused on, not just the electrical grid. But I'm going to hand it off to the next speaker, who will be able to talk more details about what can be done, not just to protect the grid, but to protect that ecosystem. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Lynn. That chronology is very, very interesting, and looking forward to getting back to the end here for a more in-depth conversation. Next, we have Peter Fisher, who is with Sierra Nevada Corporation. Take it away, Peter.
Okay, thank you, sir. And I'd also like to thank NRRI and the Gridwise Alliance for allowing me to participate in this important webinar. I'm going to start off with Sierra Nevada Corporation, just give you a quick overview of who we are. Sierra Nevada Corporation, or SNC for short, is one of the leading companies for space exploration satellites and advanced systems for military aircraft. So our work with DoD requires an intense focus on cybersecurity, which really focuses on protecting sensitive operational technologies and mission systems from cyber attacks. Very analogous to what Lynn brought up on the operational technology side, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on. So the interesting part there is the challenges to securing DoD's sensitive systems and base infrastructure is very analogous to protecting our critical infrastructure on the commercial side, and both of those areas are places that SNC has been contributing. So going over to the slides here, and again, Lynn did a great job. I don't want to go back through everything that she talked about, but I'd like to hit a few of the key highlights that she brought to light. So operational technology, or OT, is a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. In short, this is the equipment that runs the grid. So these are the physical equipment and the SCADA systems and those networks that actually make the grid run. As was pointed out earlier, OT systems traditionally have been segregated. They've been segmented into their own private network. That isn't the case anymore. Grid modernization is bringing IT and OT together, and there's a lot of business reasons to do it. You know, there's demand metering, there's operational benefits with just-in-time maintenance, those kind of things. But what that's done is it's heightened the risk of cyber to operational technology. It's brought IT type of threats to the OT space. And again, as Lynn said, operational technology cyber attacks are different. They aren't about stealing data. They aren't about stealing your IP. And even as she mentioned, they aren't necessarily about ransomware. They are about disrupting the grid. They are about damaging critical equipment, and they present a catastrophic risk to the grid. So as I go through here and on the next slides and kind of talk about some of the technologies, we'll also talk about, you know, later on in this presentation, how that may change architectures in the way you do business. Next slide, please. So this is right out of the paper that Karen mentioned, the NRRI Insight Cybersecurity paper from April. A couple of key figures out of there that I kind of wanted to use as a frame of reference for talking about technologies. On the left, you have a simplified network diagram, if you will, of a utility system. And on the right, we've got a comparison of several of the different categories of operational technology. So I'll start with unidirectional gateways, or on the far right. So unidirectional gateways are very efficient at these network boundaries with passing data from one side to the other, especially if it's one-way data flows. So think status, information, where you don't need to do command and control. You don't actually need to control devices. They're built for that. And so they very much operate on those boundaries between the operational technology and informational technology, and even between the IT and on the right one and a cloud type of architecture. The second one I'd like to talk about is next generation firewalls. So next generation firewalls are kind of the backbone of informational technology, or IT security. They are the network boundary. They are what is traditionally used to segment between these different places. So they are going to be at the boundary between OT and IT. They're going to be at the boundary between your IT systems and your cloud computing. Unlike the unidirectional gateways I mentioned, firewalls do provide bidirectional, so you can do control through them. And they also, you know, the next generation part brings in advanced analytics, machine learning, and those types of things to be able to detect real-time threats in the data flows that are passing through it. The third one I'd like to bring up, intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. Or IDS, IPS. I'm going to focus on the intrusion detection system part of that because that's a lot more common, and especially on the OT side. So there's a lot of technologies now that'll have sensors throughout your operational technology networks. They'll be getting data flows from everywhere. They'll be aggregating it together in a centralized location using AI and ML to look for patterns, to say what is normal, what is your baseline, and look for anomalies outside of that. They're very good at threat detection and alerting people, and they're very important as well for forensics. In other words, an event happened, something bad happened. The IDS is sort of the keeper of all the data and is critical for figuring out what happened. And the last one I'm going to talk about was one of the focus areas of the paper, and it's inline edge devices. So these devices are a little bit newer to the market, but currently they play a critical role, and I think long-term in solving a lot of the challenges that Lynn brought up, I think they're going to be critical as we go forward. So inline edge devices are designed with the principle that, your network boundaries are going to be compromised. And whether that's by an insider threat, whether that's by a cyber actor, people will get into your network, and rather than allowing them to do whatever they want once they get through, they are designed to be inside of that network and be a very hardened solution to keep them from doing any damage, even if they get through your outer defenses. So as the name implies, they're designed to be installed at the edge or right co-located with that critical equipment. And they're also designed to be tuned to the operations of your system. So in other words, they're designed not just to look for anomalies, but to actually only allow safe actions to happen. And I'd like to stay on this slide for a second and kind of talk through this and how these technologies might apply. Going back through a few of the most recent threats that Lynn brought up. We'll start with the Colonial pipeline. Again, as she mentioned, this was an IT attack. This is a ransomware attack on your business process systems. But what made it so important to all of us is that the operational network got shut down. And so how do you make sure that that doesn't happen? Again, having very tight network segmentation so that people can't easily traverse between your IT and your OT network. But again, if you have that idea of zero trust, you have inline edge devices on that pipeline, on those critical valves, even though your network's been compromised, you can continue to operate. And the Oldsmar, Florida water treatment plant, again, another very, very recent one where, as I understand it, somebody got into the network and then increased the sodium hydroxide by 100 times the safe levels. There's a lot of different pieces to that, including hygiene and updating your operating systems. But the other critical piece here on the operational technology side, again, once they got in, they were able to do whatever they wanted. So an inline edge device installed at those PLCs that distribute the levels of sodium hydroxide would have never allowed something that was completely unsafe to occur. And I'd like to add in sort of a theoretical scenario that maps kind of everything we talked to a grid security use case. So, and I'd like to talk a little bit about something that's common in substations, protective relays. Protective relays are designed to prevent damage to grid equipment by tripping breakers when a disturbance or fault is detected. These are typically part of your SCADA system. They're remotely accessed on your OT networks. And just like we talked about earlier, OT technologies face a lot of threats, right? Malware, malformed commands coming to these. There's a lot of threats that the firewall will prevent. It'll prevent you from having malformed data and sending malicious information to them, or trying to do remote logging into them. And the intrusion detection systems are important because they'll detect that that's happening, and they'll find out from who and from where. But the interesting part here is that these are also susceptible. These are also susceptible to valid commands that are sent out of sequence, or valid commands that are sent too rapidly. Think turning something on and off. And Lynn hinted to this a little bit about Aurora. So in short, operational technology can be vulnerable to commands that are valid and considered okay. Again, inline edge devices are designed to make sure that these conditions, that unsafe actions, so sending commands out of sequence, sending commands that don't make sense, turning a breaker on and off rapidly, that doesn't happen. So again, layering that in right at the devices and make sure nothing unsafe can happen is a critical step. Next slide, please. So I'd like to close and kind of add in a couple of details related to going beyond NERC-CIP compliance, which is definitely the baseline for security, and thinking of this in an operational zero trust model. So zero trust, I'm sure that's a buzzword that a lot of us have heard about. What zero trust really means is that no boundary or no solution is good enough in and of itself. You need to have layers, and you need to make sure that you don't trust that everything is stopped just by that single solution. So layered security is critical. Layered security that is diverse technologies. Again, use your firewalls on the outer boundary, your inner network, use an inline edge device, and then monitoring with an intrusion detection system to make sure that you understand everything. And I look forward to an opportunity to discuss this further during the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Wonderful information. I do have some questions in the Q&A box that I'd like to get before we move on to our next speaker, because they're pertinent to your presentation. Two of them are kind of tied together. So do you have a sense of what the rough cost or investment for an inline edge device would be? And then one of our participants is asking if there are recommendations to industry that might incentivize adopting OT security, thinking about how difficult it can be to adopt something new, especially given competing priorities and budget constraints.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think, it's maybe not a fair answer, but to the first part, it's, the answer is it depends. And what I would say to that cost, I think the right way to do it, in my opinion, and this is again, us being a DoD type of company, is you prioritize based on a risk model, right? Your highest risk places, the ones that you absolutely positively cannot have an issue, you start there with adding inline devices. But to give you a typical, price point, it's similar to integrating any new technology, right? But that's what I suggest, is you start at those highest priority, and whether that's 5, 10, 100, you protect those, you lock them down really well, again, based on a risk model, and you go from there. The second question, I'm sorry, sir,
It's okay. Let me repeat it. Yeah, they're asking if there were any recommendations to industry that might incentivize adopting OT security, especially based on, it's difficult to sometimes be ahead of the curve, especially given budget constraints and other competing priorities.
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I think, I know there's been a lot of discussion nationwide about infrastructure, and a lot of attention has been put on, fixing infrastructure. And I can't imagine that that the grid isn't considered critical infrastructure for those types of things. So I think maybe there's federal incentives, that type of thing. But the second way to look at it is, how do you get, another way to say it is, how do you get quote unquote bang for your buck? Or how do you make sure that when you invest in these kind of things, that you're going to do good, that you're going to get a return on investment what I would suggest is basing your decisions upon work that others have done. So for example, the Department of Energy Labs, that's a great resource. If they've tested devices, if they've come up with architectures, that de-risks things quite a bit. Obviously, the Department of Defense for defense critical electric infrastructure, they may have done testing. So if others have already validated the technologies and others have already gone out there, I think that's a great way to de-risk it. You're never going to be able to say it's free, but I think that's a great way to ensure you get a return on investment.
Great, thank you. Peter, we have a few more questions, but I'm gonna defer those to the end here. And next we'll hear from Carol Elstein. And Carol, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, sir, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this discussion. So when we look overall at the National Institute of Standards and Technologies, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, it gives us a really good basis to understand what all the controls should be and where we're looking at risk and how to start to address those risks. And so traditionally what we've seen is that organizations have spent a lot of time and energy and resources on these first sections within the NIST cybersecurity framework, on identifying those endpoints, identifying the processes, protecting them, and making sure that they're as hardened as they can be. And then as you start to go farther down the NIST framework, there's less attention. So kind of shortly following that is detect and looking at ways to proactively detect issues. When it starts to get to be respond and recover, one of the things that we've seen is that organizations took this approach that if they did a good enough job of really that front end protection, that they wouldn't necessarily need to spend much time on that respond and recover piece. And so some of what the plethora of attacks has shown us is that it's still important to work on trying to protect the edge, trying to protect the core, trying to limit the ability for a bad actor to go to different places within the organizations in terms of IT and OT, and to leverage some of what we heard Peter talk about in terms of network segmentation and zero trust networks. And it's also important to make sure that if somebody does get through all those defenses and is able to affect your infrastructure internally, that you have a prescribed way to respond and recover, and that it's been something that you have worked on and focused on. And so really looking at all of these different areas, we see organizations needing to make sure that they've gone through and looked at those overall set of controls and have a balanced approach to how we're dealing with those. If we take a look at what we've seen with some of the electric utilities or electric generation or even communications or other water utilities that we've worked with, it's that they've really spent some time and understood what some of those critical functions are. And that's typically more in that identification part in terms of looking at and understanding what the critical pieces are and all the different components that support that, as well as the data that supports it. And starting to group some of those together into manageable chunks of sets of infrastructure and support, such that then they can look at resiliency and cyber recovery for those specific areas. And that covers everything from transmission, distribution, generation, all those different components. And so as we look at utilizing the framework, we see organizations really trying to make sure that they are addressing all these different areas. If we go to the next slide, when you address these things, we see that they have both proactive and reactive approaches, in that from a proactive side, we want to make sure that the detection, the response, and the protect and recover, all those things work together in a proactive basis. So from a proactive point of view for detection, it's looking at all the components you have and understanding, is there a way for me to add additional capability to be able to detect and look for things that might be indicators of compromise. And the traditional place that we see that is proactively at the endpoints or at specific critical components like we're spoken about earlier. We're also starting to see some detection capabilities in some of the protected systems. So once we have, for instance, gotten data or capabilities protected in an offline mode, does that give us an ability to go through and do a slower crawl through that information to look for indicators of compromise that might not be apparent in the day-to-day running? Proactively on the response, it's important to understand and have regular check-in tests, and that's both for the response as well as your ability to recover. Response being something that's more personnel-based, where you would want to make sure that you have everybody's roles identified, they understand how they need to come together, they understand what actions are available to them, how they would make decisions, and get some of that in practice. So that's really on the personnel side. On the technology side, being able to proactively protect different critical infrastructure and data, and then to be able to say, okay, we want to do some testing of that. We want to run through some simulations. What would recovery look like? What is the timing? How would I know when to use it? How would I feel comfortable moving forward with what has been protected, bringing that back out into a production type status? And so doing both testing that includes personnel as well as the technology is important to be proactively looking for issues and trying to make sure that you're as prepared as possible. Once something has been detected after the point of attack, it's important that that information that you gather from detecting the attack is brought into that forensics process, and the ability for you to be able to respond proactively and respond very quickly, as well as understanding when would I go into some of my protected areas for recovery, what are all those options that are available to me, and to be able to restore data from that vault as part of an ongoing approach to that recovery. That's your immediate reaction. Once you're up and running again, the next piece that's important is really to take all those lessons learned from an actual incident and then be able to fold that in so that you continue to be more and more prepared. As we look at organizations starting to focus more on this recover piece, there's some critical components that are part of that. If we go to the next slide, we see that a lot of the things that started in a lot of the critical infrastructure in terms of isolation and really having things be separate and apart and difficult to get to is the first key component of having a recoverable capability. We want to make sure that systems that we need for recovery are isolated, generally both physically and logically, and not susceptible to the same threat profile that is available on the production side, on the operational side. That as you are taking copies into a vault or this offline capability, that it's periodic, and that every time that you bring these copies in, that you make them immutable. And when I say immutable, I mean that they're not able to be changed or deleted, even by somebody that has administrator rights. The only thing that's really possible is to extend and keep them longer than was originally thought. And then next comes this intelligence, the ability to say, you know what, we've got the data, we've got it protected. Is there a way that we can go through and read, look at the header information and maybe look at the actual file data and read through that and capture statistics on that, and then read through it the next day and capture statistics and compare those indexes to look for indicators of compromise? Is the entropy, meaning the changeability of the data, changing dramatically? Is that something that's an indicator? Does the file name and the file type, do they match? Does it make sense? If we're expecting to see a database, does it look like a database? Are there known malware extensions or things in the data? So having some of that process integrity. And then lastly, really looking at recovery and remediation, and working on those procedures so that you have some of that muscle memory, should something happen, that you know how to recover. A lot of organizations have really invested in traditional threats to their continuity of operations. And those are typically called disaster recovery. And so there's this internal thought process that organizations are protected. And what we've seen is that as you go through, if something affects the production environments, if they're covered in disaster recovery, that it's typically something where they're near real-time or real-time type of replicas. They are using the same network as production. And so what we found is that production and disaster recovery tend to get infected or have the same issue. And so that's why this isolation is really important. And this different approach complements what you might already have in process for disaster recovery. It doesn't compete with it. They really are both assigned to different needs in terms of the organization, in terms of being able to respond to business continuance issues. So that's kind of the quick overview. I'm going to turn it back over to the Commissioner, and we'll look forward to our next speaker.
Thank you, Carol. IPDR is an acronym that we hear quite frequently surrounding these cyber topics, and look forward to discussing that a little further later on in the webinar. Last and certainly not least, I want to ask Eric Myers to provide his perspective on these important topics.
Okay, I'm trying to start my video, but it is not starting in the webinar for some reason. I don't know if somebody has turned it off. There we go. Thank you, everybody.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. And pretty exciting topic, a lot of great insights up to this point. I'm Eric Myers. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of the New York Power Authority. I'm still fairly new to NYPA. I joined in December of last year. Just tell you a little bit about NYPA. We are the largest state power organization in America with 16 generating facilities and more than 1,400 circuit miles of transmission lines across the state. Our customers are primarily large and small businesses, community-owned electric systems, and rural electric cooperatives and government entities. And we pride ourselves on providing the lowest cost electricity in the state, and we are the state's only statewide electricity suppliers. So when you think about the dialogue that we just had around being targets for things like cyber adversaries, large utilities that could potentially impact large geographies and customers would be an attractive target. So obviously this topic is of great interest to us. And so we manage these risks through a comprehensive multi-year program that in a continual state of renewal that is based upon frameworks like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the Lockheed Martin Kill Chain Framework, MITRE ATT&CK, and others to help us understand and manage the various dimensions of these threats. Now, I mentioned I came to NYPA in December of last year. Prior to that, I'd spent lengthy careers in two major global manufacturing organizations, both of which were U.S. defense contractors. And so I had a lot of experience in dealing with advanced cyber attacks dating back to the mid-2000s when the term APT actually first came into existence. And, as I reflect on where we are today and all of the trends that we've seen, if you think about the basics of all of the cyber intrusions and things that we're seeing in the news today, not much has really changed. The actual tools and techniques that the adversaries use to get into organizations hasn't changed that much. They're still using phishing messages and malware and taking advantage of poor security configurations and weak authentication. So, you know, why haven't we fixed this? And why has it taken us so long? What's really changed? Why are we seeing this explosion of these things today? Well, what really has changed in the interim is we've seen an explosion of the exposure factor of these things. Back in the mid-2000s, when these attacks were first starting to take place, those capabilities were typically the exclusive domain of well-funded state-sponsored actors. So you didn't see a lot of those types of attacks. Fast forward to today, those capabilities have been democratized to where anybody can get their hands on them, and in fact, can be bought as services. Ransomware as a service, for example, we've heard that term used this year in a number of the attacks that have been discussed. And so what that's had the effect of doing is now merging those who have the motive to cause harm to an organization with the means to cause that harm. You know, to have a successful cyber attack, you've got to have the motive, means, and the opportunity to all come together. So bringing those factors together is what's brought us to this state today. Now, I think there's a bit of a silver lining in everything that we're seeing, to be perfectly honest with you. If you look at some of the recommendations coming out in the various federal executive orders and 100-day plans and so forth, they really are focused on the things that we've been doing all along. Basic hygiene, multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection and response, monitoring and logging, and so forth. And so that tells us that we really have the opportunity to apply these basics and have an effect on this. Another piece that's different, and I think we've learned this over the years, is that no one organization has the visibility and wherewithal to fight this battle alone. This really is a collective defense effort. And so that's why you see so much emphasis now in the 100-day plan around things like information sharing, because we must have broader visibility to do these things. So that exposure factor that we talked about by commoditizing those tools, getting them in the hands of more people, that's only part of the challenge that we face today. We're actually creating some of our own new exposure risks as you think about all of the transformational trends that we see in our industry. Things like digitization, the introduction of distributed energy resources. All of those things are going to require new tools and technologies that we're going to need to connect into our systems and our grid that is potentially a new path for the attackers. So we're going to have to think differently about how we mitigate those new attack paths. The attack surface is exploding for all of us as well. So how do we think about managing that? And the last piece of this, and I think Carol mentioned it well in her talk, is we think about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And just another observation is that in the past, we've all been very heavily focused on prevention and detection tools, and somewhat less so on things like response and recovery. And with the advent of all of these ransomware incidents that we've seen over the last year, I think we're starting to see more and more of that. So all of our organizations are thinking about how do we maintain business continuity? In the heat of the moment, how do we run through the decisioning process? If you remember some of the testimony that the CEO of the Colonial pipeline had to give to Congress, he had to make a split-second decision whether or not to shut down that pipeline to preserve the integrity of the machinery, or again cause further disruption that could have lasted even longer. Have we tested that organizational decision-making capability in the heat of the moment? That's where things like tabletop exercises are becoming increasingly important at all of our organizations. And again, the last piece I want to mention is, as we think about the notion of the ecosystem, kind of reflect on what happened in Oldsmar, Florida. I mean, that's a small utility, and many of these small utilities don't have the wherewithal to implement the types of cyber protections that larger organizations have in place today. So they become that soft underbelly that could potentially threaten the integrity of the entire grid. And in fact, as you think about what happened in the financial sector about 10 years ago when they were getting hit so heavily, as the large banks were able to invest in advanced cyber capabilities and began to to thwart these attackers. The attackers moved on to targets of opportunity. They were going to the small regional banks and credit unions and so forth. And so as we think about our work here today as a collective and protecting the integrity of our grid, we need to think about those smaller utilities. In our case, it's our customers, these small municipal and rural co-ops across the state that provide power to end customers. How do we help bring them into the fold to protect the integrity of the system, because they become that soft underbelly. So, I think that's all I had to cover today.
Great, thank you, Eric. At this point, we'll move into the just general discussion. I've got a long list of questions in the Q&A box, and at this, I'll take this opportunity to ask if you do have a question for any of the panelists or a specific panelist, please enter that into the Q&A box in the Zoom app, and we will be monitoring that. First question, and this is one that I would echo as a commissioner. What resources are available to state utility commissions to help evaluate a utility's cybersecurity posture and determine whether utility is making reasonable and effective cyber investments, especially when we get into some of the rate recovery aspects? And I want to start with Lynn on this question. And Lynn, I know that our commission here in Indiana has gone through the NARUC cybersecurity manual and utilized that with some of our utilities. Can you talk a little bit about that manual, and then maybe we'll pass it off after that to other panelists?
Sure, thank you for that question. Certainly we know that cybersecurity workforce is a serious challenge to protecting critical infrastructure. And ideally, the responsibility for doing that is the utility itself, but you know that there are a lot of other stakeholders that have a piece of that responsibility to protect critical infrastructure. One of the challenges with the workforce gap is when you're talking about a public utility commission, many commissions don't necessarily consider cybersecurity as their role or responsibility. I think that has changed a lot. However, they still don't have access to the same kind of resources that a utility would have. So for NARUC, it was important to educate our membership on cybersecurity risks, on cybersecurity risk management, and give them resources that they could use to engage utilities on discussions of cybersecurity, recognizing that cybersecurity is not necessarily a PUC's real knowledge, core knowledge base. So we had this idea to put together a manual of resources, a toolkit, put them in the hands of public utility commissions to help them know what the right questions to ask of a utility about their cybersecurity risk management policies, processes, and procedures. We gave them a tool that's, I call it a mini maturity model, to help understand the responses that they were getting back from the utility. And then we also put together a tabletop exercise guide so we could help the utility, the PUC, work with utilities to show how to really focus on that response and recovery aspect that Carol and Eric, you really highlighted. That is so important. If anything, all of those threats that have actually turned into realized attacks show us is that we will be victims at some point, and we need to be able to be sure that we can respond and recover as quickly as possible. So putting that tool, those toolkits into the hands of public utility commissioners was really very important. The other thing that we do is we bring subject matter expertise into public utility commissions through events like this. We raise awareness, we educate, we connect them with subject matter expertise. You're still on mute, Commissioner.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Lynn. Any other of the panelists like to cover this topic of what state utility commissions should be looking for and how we should be addressing some of these topics?
I think part of the prior question there was asking about what resources we had available to us to help understand our current state. And CISA has a great guide out there. They offer some assessments to critical infrastructure operators to help them understand their current state. I can post a link in the chat here for everybody. That would be very helpful. So.
Great. And we'll try and get a link also to the cybersecurity manual that NARUC has put together that I asked Lynn about, and she was discussing. As I mentioned before, our commission here in Indiana has utilized that with several of our small natural gas utilities and are working through some of the responses that we've received and plan to continue those conversations later into the year. So it's been very helpful for us. Anyone else want to comment on that question? Yes, Carol.
I'd like to just comment and say one of the things that we can learn from some of the other industries is that as organizations focused on their own cybersecurity preparedness, that what was initially found was really trying to take a look at the upstream and downstream dependencies. And so the producers and the generators and the distributors making sure that if you're doing something to protect your piece, that if you're reliant on somebody or somebody's relying on you, that you have an open dialogue about what's expected and to start to look for some commonality about your capabilities, because any deficiency in any one part of that can affect you, even if you're not specifically, it's not specifically in your organization.
I think SolarWinds was a great wake-up call for us in that regard. And I think there's another lesson in SolarWinds that we all need to keep in mind, even as we think about our next generation security controls, and that's the notion of systemic risk. If we all end up doing all of the same thing with all of the same tools across all of our organizations, we do create a level of systemic risk, because those tools will become targeted. And we will see those environments targeted, and it could have a catastrophic impact. So there's some value in diversity and thinking about how we solve these problems.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to another question here. Has there been any effort to define the subset of NERC SIP that would be effective for distribution systems? No takers.
Well, I will say this.
Go ahead and share.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lynn.
No, I was just going to say, I can't speak to the NERC SIP standards specifically, but the security of distribution level assets, distributed energy resources is certainly of interest to public utility commissions. And we are working cooperatively with NASIO, the National Association of State Energy Officials, to look at particularly the cybersecurity risks of solar. So there will be more work coming out on that project early next year, but we're also now looking at beyond solar. What are the cybersecurity risks of other distributed energy resources? So if there's going to be a NERC SIP-like set of requirements around those resources, I can't say, but I do know it's very much of interest to the community at large.
And if I could jump in, when I was at the Department of Energy, I was working on the quadrennial energy review, and we did spend a lot of time looking at the issue of the jurisdictional lines for around security and trying to figure out if there was a way to take some of the federal requirements and explore what you could do in the clear jurisdiction of the states over when there's a cybersecurity issue, and those risks seem to be different than the other kinds of things that you generally worry about with the Federal Power Act and jurisdictional issues. But we didn't really find a silver bullet, a way to, other than to provide, significant resources for the states to deal with their distribution systems. I will say that Gridwise held, we do monthly themes, and our monthly theme a couple months ago was cybersecurity. And in our policy council meeting, we had Democrat and Republican staffers from the Senate Energy Committee join us, because they are writing a bill on cybersecurity and DER. And I don't know what is going to be in that bill, but they had a lot of questions about the implications of DER on cyber. So I think there are, a lot of focus on this issue, and some attempts to craft policy around how you would protect the distribution system.
Great, thank you. Another question: how much needs to be done in coordination with the federal government? The White House met today with some major utilities and the sectors. Does there need to be more support or funding from the federal government? And I'd like to add into this topic a question about the executive order that was issued back in May by the Biden administration on cybersecurity. If someone could kind of encapsulate what all is included in that and what state commissions should be looking at with regard to that executive order.
I'll jump in with my perspective on the executive order. And again, it was very much focused on federal acquisitions, federal systems, but the requirements that were outlined in it, again, goes back to, these are the basics that every organization should be doing. The multi-factor authentication, the basic hygiene, monitoring, logging, all of those things. And so my perspective on the real value of that's going to become the de facto standard, reasonable and customary that all of our organizations need to be. That's the new baseline. And I think the great thing, the silver lining that's come out of all of these ransomware attacks, is it's raising that level of awareness and forcing us all to do that, because there's going to be a time when money isn't the motive for one of these types of attacks. It'll be an act of war. And by going through this exercise now, we'll all be in a better position to help defend our critical infrastructure.
And I'd like to add to that, something that Peter was talking about, zero trust architecture. That was specifically called out in that cybersecurity order. And Eric, I couldn't agree with you more. The attention on cybersecurity certainly has grown over time. And it's not that we have not attempted to be more proactive about addressing our risks. But I think it's just, recently we've said we've had enough. The threats are growing in terms of the sheer number of attacks, the number of successful attacks, the consequences of the attacks are growing. We had to do something. I think it was just the recognition that if we don't do it now, we're never going to get out in front of this.
Yeah, and from my point of view, I think you have to look at the executive order and then the corresponding memo. They were both very similar. One is really more targeted at government agencies, and one more at the broader commercial space, right? So, but they have similarities in that they're drawing on well-known, well-documented frameworks like you find with CISA and NIST, and really just highlighting it to try to boil it down to, if you were going to focus on a few things, what would they be? And so in my reading of it, there's really 5 main things. And the first is that, offline protection of your backup data, to make sure your systems are patched on a regular basis and up to date. That incident response plan, so some of what I think I talked about and some of the others talked about in terms of making sure that we have walkthroughs and tabletop testing to understand what incident response would look like. To have maybe some outside input to your security team. And I think addressing some of that, only seeing what you expect to see, that you end up, if you're only really looking at your own things. And then that last piece is just what Lynn spoke about, really talking about segmenting and that zero trust networking.
Great. This is a question that's specific to, directed to Eric, but I'm curious the thoughts from the other panelists. So, and this is a question that could easily come from even myself, because this is what keeps me up at night, is smaller utilities, the less sophisticated, the ones who have less bandwidth for capital investment. What should we be looking for, and what would you recommend for a smaller utility as far as that fundamental protection?
Great question. So I'll share specifically what NYPA is doing in that regard, because we've had that very same concern. How do we help our munis and co-ops around the state get that necessary level of cyber capability in place? And it really falls into three broad categories. When you think about, and somebody mentioned it in this panel earlier, it's around the skill sets. Many small organizations don't have deep cyber skills. So how do we find ways to economically let them build those talents and skill sets? Second piece, how do we bring those tools and technologies to them that help them solve some of the unique problems in their space? And it's going to require some technical innovation. And the third piece is, how do we bring services to them in an affordable way where we can leverage economies of scale to bring them to them at low cost? And we can't do this alone, but we're doing those three things in something we call our Cybersecurity Center of Excellence program, where we're partnering with technology providers, figuring out ways to bring them to those capabilities to these organizations at a lower cost. But as you think about that, even a lower cost, it could be prohibitive for some organizations. So, as we think about the audience that we have here today, public utility commissioners and so forth, it may take regulation to help us set what the new bar is that says every critical infrastructure organization must have A, B, and C in place. The things that are outlined perhaps in the federal executive order, just to set that new baseline so that we don't end up with what happened in Oldsmar, Florida.
Sure. Anyone else want to take that?
Yeah, if I could jump in,
Sure.
I'm adding myself to the panel, but we've been advocating in the infrastructure package for special resources for small and medium utilities. And there is money. There's not a lot of money for cybersecurity at DOE in the infrastructure package. We'd love to see more, but we're told that they'll do that through appropriations, not the infrastructure package. But what is in the infrastructure package is specifically targeted for small and medium utilities. And a lot of what DOE does in those programs is funnel money through NRECA, the Rural Co-op Association, and APPA, the Public Power Association, to then provide resources to their members. And much of those resources are in line of things like monitoring platforms, where a number of utilities can join this monitoring platform that's run by a third party and get instant alerts for when there are actual threats, and sharing real-time information. We've been advocating for additional money for actual technology deployment along the lines of the inline edge devices and other like hardware, and software that you need in addition to the workforce training and the monitoring platforms. But there will be money targeted for small, medium utilities very quickly, very soon.
And important to mention of that is to keep this notion of a collective defense in mind. As we view each of those small utilities out there as a potential sensor in the broader ecosystem. Make sure that we have a way to identify those alerts and process them, and be able to take a look from an ecosystem perspective.
Yeah, thank you both. Peter, please.
If I could add in, I also think, prioritization. So there's a lot of characterizing systems that's going on right now, and identifying which ones you need to protect first, right? It can be a big problem, and it can be a problem that's not solvable in 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. Look at the ones that matter the most, protect those first, and have it be that kind of thing. And I know, as Karen said, NRECA might be a great resource for helping folks get to how do I prioritize that, right? Availability and criticality. I think that's a good approach for people to to think of, hey, I've only got so many resources. How do I spend them the most wisely?
Peter, just to follow on to that, the other side of prioritization is, so now once we know what we want to protect, what cyber investments do we need to be making? Because, I think small organizations wouldn't even know where to start. And of all of the thousands of security vendors you see out there, and I'm sure everybody's seen the Momentum Cyber slide that has the thousands of vendors or what in every category, it's daunting. You could buy one of everything on there and still not fix all of your problems. So how do you think about the problems you want to solve? And so one of the things that we do, and it actually helps our stakeholders understand, people like cyber folks like to use the big scary numbers. Look at all the things that are bouncing off of our firewalls. Give us lots of money. And that's all they hear is big scary numbers and lots of money. But how do we do this in a purposeful way? And so the approach we take is we actually use the Lockheed Martin Cyber Kill Chain Framework and articulate that as a process that a cyber adversary is going to go through to target an organization. People can understand that. And then we anchor it in another framework that most of our stakeholders understand, Six Sigma. If you think about that as a Six Sigma process for success for the bad guy, we want to find ways to introduce defects into the bad guy's process. So we're looking for tools and technologies that are going to help us do that. How do we break something for the bad guy? And that's where things like multi-factor authentication come in. And it takes multiple controls. So what we do is we then take our portfolio of tools and capabilities, both current and planned, and show where they map into the kill chain framework so we can show exactly how we're slowing the bad guys down before they get through that process. And we also use that as a point to emphasize the continuous nature of investment that's required. These tools become obsolete. You put them out there, the bad guys will figure out how to get around them. They become less effective. You've got to reinvest. Cyber is not a once and done exercise. And so that helps reinforce that message with folks.
Great. Thank you, Thad. I want to ask Peter we've got a number of questions that are around the inline edge devices. Are we talking about something that's a physical device, or is this software that can be implemented? Can you talk a little bit more just about what that technology is?
Yeah, and I'm sorry for glossing through that really quickly, but and the white paper talks in detail about them, but inline edge devices are intended to be a physical system that's installed between the operational technology network and the device it's protecting. So all data flows through it. It could be virtualized depending on your architecture, but in general, it's easier to picture it as something that's between your critical system, think transformer, think RTU at a station. All data flows through the inline device that's located right by it, and then you go back to the network. Hopefully that helps clarify.
Okay. I'm working through questions. I will ask if you've got a question that's in the chat that hasn't been asked, and you want to add that over into the Q&A function. That would be super helpful to track so that I make sure that I get to everything. So I've got a long question here. I'm going to read it. Mr. Fisher mentioned relying on existing validated technologies to de-risk investment for OT, and pointed towards DOE and DOD, DCEI as places to look. The original question was aimed at industry. I'd like to know if any procurement or compliance standards exist that could be readily used by PUCs in their oversight of utility procurement. Are there existing models, frameworks, or databases that regulators can use or reference as a standard of utility procurement for operational technology?
I can give it a quick one, and I know Eric's probably got a lot of good answers here, but CISA is a good place to start. I think they're looking at putting that together. I don't think it's quite there yet, but that is an example of kind of how they're looking at getting to that. Again, if you are looking at something that does touch the defense industry, DISA is another one. DISA and NIAP, if it actually is going to touch those kind of federal networks. But I'll hand it over to others because I know there's some other ideas going around.
Yeah, and so along those lines, we've actually developed our own contract language addendum to actually go pretty deep on some of the requirements, questions, and so forth for anything that has any sort of code embedded in it that could potentially touch something. And we actually have two variations of that, one for BES and one for non-BES systems.
That parlays well into the next. Sorry, Karen or Lynn, go ahead.
No, that was me. I also thought that the Electric Sector Coordinating Council had developed some template language around procurement, cybersecurity procurement specifically. I will look online, and if I find that, I'll pass it along to Sherry and the others at NRRI to share with this group.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on this question?
I'm just going to offer a provocative thought for us to think about as we go forward here. All of these assessments and contract language, things that we do, they're point in time measurements. And the pace with which technology and service providers move today, I think we need to start getting to the point where we define the notion of a material change in how a service is delivered, and then require notification from technology providers to notify us when they make a material change. If they're changing where a backend system is providing a system is hosted, maybe it's moving to a hostile geography, we want to know that so we can make some decisioning around that, and it should come with contract termination clauses if we don't like it. So we should start thinking about moving in that direction.
If I could add in there as well, is something that was in my slide, but I didn't talk a lot about it, is, you know, obsolescence of technology, right? As the threats change, Eric, you really brought up that the attack vectors change, right? That may lead an architecture to become obsolete, and in some cases it could be catastrophically obsolete, right? You know, where it's suddenly one day it was great, one day it wasn't good. So it is, you do have to be a little bit cautious with relying 100% on these frameworks or other tools.
Wonderful. I want to note that we're at the end of our time this afternoon, and I want to say thank you to each of you for your perspectives and sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to Gridwise Alliance and your collaboration on this. I would push you to download the paper that was the insight paper that Peter and Karen worked on with NRRI that was put out back in April. There's a lot of great information, and I note too that Lynn and Eric have posted some links to other information in the chat. Sherry, is there any other housekeeping matters that I've missed?
Thank you, Commissioner. I think it was quite fascinating. I'm now going to go lock all my doors and windows and make sure no threats can get in. We will be posting the recording of this webinar on the NRRI YouTube channel, and that'll happen in the next couple of days. I thank you, Commissioner, and panelists. It was fascinating, and thank you to the Gridwise Alliance for joining us here. So everyone, have a wonderful afternoon, and if you have any other questions, please email us. Bye, everyone.